If a piece of music is really successful, there's almost always something that you can learn from it. So I think that there's a lot to learn from Toxic. Apparently, Toxic was released in 2003. Makes me feel a little old. How about you? I remember that even when this piece was released, I found it really interesting, and I'm curious to know what compositional techniques were used in this piece that made it so engaging. Let's watch it and find out.
Baby, can't you see I'm calling? A guy like you should wear a warning. It's dangerous. I'm falling. There's no escape. I can't wait. I need a hit. Baby, give me it. You're dangerous. I'm loving it. Too high, can't come down.
Okay, so here's what I think. It feels like the voice is the melody and the bass is playing a counter melody. Rather than being a foundation of the piece, just like keeping track of the tempo, the bass is actually playing an active role in contributing to a melodic line. So I wonder how they did that and managed to keep a strong sense of foundation. I think that the instrument that sounds a bit like Spanish guitar is picking up a lot of the slack in the percussion. The percussion is very simple. It's just like a kick and a snare, but the rhythm guitar is filling in a lot of the gaps, and so the bass is free to explore rather than just sticking to like more of a foundational, simple rhythmic structure.
There's no escape. I can't wait. I need a hit. Baby, give me it. You're dangerous. I'm loving it. Too high, can't come down. Losing my head, spinning round.
Okay, so another thing that's really effective about this piece is the mix. So something that mixers do is they arrange the sounds so that they sound like they're coming from different parts of the room. And so to really show off Britney's voice in the chorus, she's on the sides and there's a number of different recordings of her singing the same thing, and they're all just kind of filling up both sides of your ears. And then there's a synth that sounds similar to her voice that's dead center. I didn't notice that the first time, but if you really listen, you can hear that it's not a singer that's in the center. It's kind of a funny sounding synth that glides around almost like a human voice would. It's a fun trick for the ears. So I'm gonna rewind. I'll go back to the beginning. We'll hear that again.
Baby, can't you see I'm calling? A guy like you should wear a warning. It's dangerous. I'm falling. There's no escape. I can't wait. I need a hit. Baby, give me it. You're dangerous. I'm loving it.
Apparently, the strings are a sample from a Bollywood movie. I only learned this recently from an article that I read when I was doing a little bit of research, and that's pretty cool. I think a lot of people have different opinions about sampling, but the way that I see it is that I just want to hear some good music. And so if you take something that's already compelling and you use it to make a new piece of music, why not? It may increase the likelihood that you write something good. But one of the first things I notice about this piece of music is it sounds like it has an unstable tonal center. So it keeps coming back to C minor, but it almost sounds like at some point, will it resolve to another chord? It doesn't, but it keeps the listener in a state of uncertainty, and that makes them more curious to hear the rest of the piece. And I think the way that they accomplish that is through the scale that they use. This string sample that they got from Bollywood, it may be based on a scale that isn't commonly used in Western music, so that already sets it apart from a lot of pop pieces. In the string sample, it's basically in a C minor scale. It really emphasizes the flat 5, which is a tritone from the tonic. The flat 5 is used in Western music occasionally in blues, but this doesn't sound like blues. The flat 5 sounds like a really important part of the scale somehow. So I did a little bit of digging because I wanted to figure out, okay, what scale is being used? After playing around with it on the piano a little bit, I think that it is the Hungarian minor scale. And that would explain why the tonic feels really unstable, because that is common to the scale. It also really emphasizes the tritone above the tonic, or the flat 5, and so I'll play it for you on the piano. I think it's open to interpretation, so if you have a different idea, I'd love to hear it. So I think it's some variation of that scale, or maybe the scale itself. Although while the piece has maybe a more Eastern influence of the scale that they use, it's also pretty jazzy. So in the chorus, there's a lot of chord progressions that go down chromatically, and it's very often used in jazz. So I feel like it's kind of a fusion between a scale that is not commonly used in Western music, so perhaps the Hungarian minor scale, and jazz and pop, which is a lot to think about, to be honest. I mean, I think the songwriters, they could have been or they could not have been thinking of this consciously. And this is something that's really cool about music that you also find in literature. So sometimes the author will create something that has this complexity that they may not have been consciously aware of, but the genius just kind of shone through regardless. And so it's open to a lot of different interpretations, and it leaves people thinking for years. I think this piece might be one of those things, but we'll see. So if you listen to the instrumentation, well, there's the string section, there's the synth bass, which is pretty common in pop music. There's two different types of guitars. There's like a Spanish sounding guitar, and then there's kind of an old school surf sounding guitar, and that's mixed with Britney's voice, which is already really unique. So there's a lot of sounds in this song that are seemingly disparate, but I think that they all come together really nicely, and I'll get into why I think that is in a minute. Okay, I noticed a few things here. So one thing that I think is perhaps Britney Spears' biggest talent is changing the timbre of her voice as a musical expression. So some singers will practice like making their voice sound brighter or darker, or introducing more of a nasally sound, or making it sound airy and thin. And she uses all of those techniques as easily as most singers just use volume to express themselves. She is constantly changing the quality of the sound that comes out of her mouth. So sometimes if there's a lot of intensity, she gives a bite to it and it's a little bit nasally. And then sometimes when she's sitting back, like in the chorus, she introduces this very ethereal, airy quality to her voice that is such a cool talent to have to bring to singing. I think the level at which she is talented at that is probably akin to some of the best voice actors out there. So like if you're a fan of watching cartoons like say The Simpsons, a lot of the characters will be voiced by the same person because they're able to introduce different sound qualities into their voice to make it sound as if they're a different human that's talking. And Britney is doing that as a musical expression constantly. I mean, she's very well known for using the vocal fry, the kind of, the vocal fry. I can't really do it. So she's already well known for using a vocal fry in her voice, which makes it sound kind of deep and, oh, there it is. That's my vocal fry. So using things like the vocal fry, like introducing a nasally sound, doing all of these things at will as a musical expression is, I would say, fairly unique to her as a musician. Most singers tend to sing with the same timbre regardless of what they're trying to express. Sometimes they'll bring in a little bit more depth or darkness, but usually it's pretty subtle. And so I think this is what sets her apart from a lot of other singers, and it makes her really interesting because she's giving voice to all these different feelings as if almost as a voice actor would with different characters, but putting them all into the same piece of music. And so I noticed that there are actually a few different takes of her with different style of voices in the chorus. So you can hear on one side, I think it's the right side, that she has like a nasally bite to her voice, and then on the other side it's kind of airy. So let's listen to that part of the chorus. Okay, this is a great example of how Britney uses timbre as a musical device. So in the chorus, the lyrics are, "With a taste of your lips, I'm on a ride." As she sings "with the taste of your lips," she starts to develop more of a sharp intensity in her voice. And then as she sings "ride," the timbre decreases in intensity and it sounds more pure and airy as opposed to focused and sharp. So as she's singing a phrase, she's changing the tonal quality of her voice to give the words meaning and musical expression. It makes sense the way that she's doing it. With the taste of your lips, the song is about how the person that she kisses is toxic, so there's some frustration there. But when she sings "ride," there's this kind of light, airy quality that denotes how someone might feel under the circumstances of the character in the piece. So when she sings "ride," "ride" has this feel-good quality. I'm impressed by the ability to use timbre as a musical device, partly because it makes for an interesting problem in composition. This is why if you write a piece of classical music, you're giving it to performers and they can do as they will with it. So let's say you write a violin concerto and the violinist has a different timbre than what you were imagining. It can really change the impact of the music, just as Britney is doing here with her voice. From the standpoint of composition, this is something that people try to notate sometimes by, writing above the score, like "sing this brightly," for example. But I think performers, even classical performers, could take notes from Britney's ability to use timbre as such a powerful, expressive musical device. Another technique that's used very effectively in this piece is silence, or taking away some of the instruments to make a pretty profound change in the music that can leave audiences a little bit confused, like, oh, everything dropped out, what's going to happen next? So they do that a lot here. Like at the beginning, they had a few instruments playing, the strings, some drums, and then it cut out entirely. There was silence, and then Britney started singing. So that creates this sense of anticipation, like, oh, I was hearing something and it stopped. Is it going to start again? And so they do that again in the chorus. Everything drops out except for this very distorted guitar sound. Oddly enough, you wouldn't think it, but silence and decreasing the number of instruments that are playing can add to the intensity because there's this anticipation of what may happen next. This helps reiterate that a successful composition isn't just about what exactly the audience is hearing in the moment, but also how they're feeling about what they might hear next. That's a bit of a long sentence, but I guess a successful composition isn't just about writing something that's beautiful or engaging, but also playing with the audience a little bit so that they have some level of uncertainty about what's going to come next. Because otherwise they're not going to feel the reward of predicting what's going to come next. They're just going to feel like they know it intuitively. The relief of hearing what you think you're going to hear is a little bit of a dopamine hit. So okay, I'm gonna go back to the chorus again.
Losing my head, spinning round and round. Do you feel me now? With a taste of your lips, I'm on a ride. You're toxic, I'm slipping up. With a taste of
So this section here is where it gets very chromatic. The chords kind of go down chromatically, which is a pretty jazzy way of doing it. But because they're using a pattern of notes prior to this that sound unusual for Western music, I feel a sense of confusion about exactly what genre to place this song in as I'm listening to it. It's not playing by any of the rules, but I think that's kind of what the song is about.
poison paradise. I'm addicted to you. Don't you know that you're toxic? And I love what you do. Don't you know that you're toxic? It's getting late to give you up. I took a sip from my devil's cup. Slowly, it's taking over me. Too high, can't come down. It's in the air, it's all around. Can you feel it? With a taste of
I think partly what makes this song successful is that the instruments used in it sound so different from one another. And I think that might be the case because when an instrument has a very different sound quality to another instrument, they create a different set of overtones. Every instrument, including the human voice, emits sound frequencies, and the one that we mostly talk about is called the fundamental frequency. That's the one that you are most likely to hear and recognize. But there are other frequencies that are also present that give the instrument its own specific sound quality. So like a trumpet sounds very different to a clarinet, which sounds very different to a violin, which sounds very different to Britney Spears. So even though they might all be playing the same pitch, the same fundamental, there are other frequencies as well above the fundamental that give the instrument a unique sound. So I theorize that because there are so many unique timbres in this piece, there are a lot of different overtones, and it gives it the sense of fullness that you get when you listen to like a full orchestra. A full orchestra is the same because it's not just strings, it's brass instruments, it's percussion, it's the woodwinds, which all are fairly unique from one another. So I think that this piece is very successful in what I would call the orchestration, which is like which instruments it chose. And this is an interesting debate to have about pop music versus classical music, because in classical music, generally 99.99% of the time, the composers are using an orchestration that has already been written for. So if someone writes for full orchestra, it's expected that there are going to be X number of violins, X number of violas, X number of clarinets. The orchestration is already set. And that happened over time. It wasn't overnight. It was gradually composers realized what they thought sounded best, and we kind of fell into this habit of defining a full orchestra as being X, Y, or Z. There is a bit of an evolution that happened in that process. If you listen to or are familiar with galant music, which is pre-classical, the orchestras were very different. The instruments themselves were also quite different. Some of the instruments that are present in modern full orchestras didn't exist when Beethoven was writing music, like the tuba, for example. So as a tangent, like tubists, people that play the tuba, they often won't play a number of the pieces that a symphony is playing because no music was written for that instrument until after it had been invented. So composers today are more or less given a set of different ensembles to choose from that create an interesting timbre, but they don't generally color outside of the lines of that. Sometimes they do, but not very often. Whereas pop music is the opposite. So in pop music, generally one is expected to have one's own set of sounds. Like if I were to write a piece that used identical synths and sounds and samples to this one, there might very well be a lawsuit. But in classical music, that's standard. You're supposed to use the exact same set of sounds as everybody else. And so I think a lot of the creative process in writing pop music comes to deciding which sounds to use. And as we know from, the evolution of the orchestra in classical music to some of the jazz bands, big bands, and even some of the pop songs that we hear today, the choices that you make in a group of instruments will affect the overall sound profoundly. And so I think part of what makes this piece really successful is that they have a good orchestration. So they managed to settle on what I would call an ensemble or a collection of instruments that fit really well together, just like a modern day orchestra did. It took some trial and error to get to the modern day orchestra from the sets and groups of instruments that we had prior to that. So that shows a lot of ingenuity on the part of the writers of this piece. I think something that creates some confusion between people that write classical music and people that write pop music is this particular expectation that in pop music, a lot of times the creativity lies in choosing the particular sounds that you're going to use. Whereas in classical music, those are just taken for granted. And you try to use those sounds in a unique way to create your own piece of music. That might be why in classical music, a lot of the emphasis is placed on the form of a piece, the harmonic content of the piece, the melody of the piece, because they're not exploring a new and unique soundscape that you might get with pop music. So yeah, that long tangent aside, I think that what I'm calling the orchestration of this piece, which is the choice of instruments, is why it's successful dance music, but there isn't a lot of percussion in the piece. So I think some of the intensity is just from the uniqueness of all the different timbres in the song, including Britney's voice. I will say Britney's voice is definitely part of that, and her ability to explore timbre almost certainly helped with the creation of such a unique piece of music. I really like that bass glide. Woo! It's back here. So that's another way they played with expectations. A lot of instruments dropped out for a while, so you're sat there wondering, okay, when are they going to come back? And they came back in a really unique place. Usually when instruments reappear in a piece, it's like on the first beat of a measure, but this was on a pickup. It was a surprise. This is where it happens. This is where you can hear that there are different takes of Britney singing, and in the right ear there's more of a bite to it. There's a little bit more of an intensity in her voice, and on the left ear it's a little bit more of a like an airy, soothing voice, and that disparity is interesting to listen to. Well, that was really fun to listen to. Apparently, this piece is still popular after almost 20 years of being around, so let's see how much longer it sticks around for. I think that this was and still is a popular piece for a very good reason, or a number of good reasons, and so I believe that all genres of music are worth listening to. If a lot of people like a piece of music, there's something that you can learn from it. And so what I learned from this is to play around with using different scalar patterns, like ones that aren't typically used in Western music. That will already give you a leg up, so to say, because your piece will stand out compared to other pieces in the same genre. B, orchestration is really important even in pop music. So if you're writing a piece of pop music, it's worthwhile to spend a long time listening to the different sounds that you're using and whether or not they fit together, or if they're very different. Are they different in a way that's complementary? As in, do they create an interesting soundscape that people want to listen to? It might be that if you're starting to write a piece and you're playing with two different ideas and they sound very different, it may sound off-putting at first, but maybe adding that third can make it all blend together. I don't know, it's worth experimenting with. I think this piece also teaches that it's okay to play with your bass instruments and to not force them into this role of just playing, the same thing over and over again, a boring foundation, just playing quarter notes or eighth notes. If you have other instruments compensate for maintaining a strong sense of beat, then the bass can do as it wishes. I also think this piece is a good reference to mix too, so the voice in a song doesn't always have to be dead center. The takes that you use don't even have to be that similar. You can have a take where the singer is singing in low intensity and a take where they're singing high intensity and put them together and just see what happens. I think that's what's fun about this piece, is that they were obviously experimenting and playing around and just enjoying the process, and that's why we get to have such a unique piece of music, because they weren't playing by the rules. Break the rules, see what happens. I also think that if any singers out there are able to use Britney's technique of playing with timbre as a musical device, they might be able to record some really interesting pieces. So that's definitely worth practicing. I think that the writers of the song and the mixers and the producers and the mastering engineers and Britney all made some very interesting musical choices, and that there's something that can be gleaned or learned from them. What do you think? So if you write or play or sing in a totally different genre of music, would you take something from this piece and learn from it? I would.